One of the biggest misunderstandings people have when dealing with a narcissist is believing that the problem lies in finding the right words. So they spend months, sometimes years, rehearsing conversations in their mind. They think, if I can just explain myself more clearly, if I can just make them understand how much they've hurt me, surely something will change. But the painful reality is that this belief keeps you trapped in the very cycle you're trying to escape. The narcissist is rarely searching for understanding. They are searching for emotional engagement. Whether that engagement comes through your tears, your anger, your frustration, your fear, or even your desperate attempts to be loved, it all serves the same purpose. It keeps the connection alive on their terms. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because most healthy relationships teach us that communication solves problems. We grow up believing that honesty builds trust, that vulnerability creates intimacy, and that sincere conversations bring people closer together. Those principles work when both people genuinely care about one another's emotional well being. But when you're dealing with a narcissist, the rules are different. Communication often becomes another arena for control rather than connection. Bling D. Think about how many times you've walked away from a conversation, feeling more confused than when it started. You entered with clear thoughts, determined to express your feelings calmly. Yet somehow, by the end, you're apologizing for things you didn't do, questioning your own memory, or trying to defend yourself against accusations that appeared out of nowhere. That isn't an accident, it's a pattern. The conversation itself and every emotional response you offer gives the narcissist more opportunities to manipulate the direction of that battle. Many people assume that conflict is what a narcissist enjoys most. In reality, conflict is simply one method. The real reward is emotional influence. They want proof that they still occupy space in your mind. If your mood depends on their words, if your peace disappears because of their criticism, if your entire day revolves around trying to fix what they created, then they still have power. It doesn't matter whether you're praising them or arguing with them. From their perspective, both reactions confirm that they remain emotionally significant in your life. Burn. This is why so many people become exhausted. They mistake constant emotional engagement for progress. Every argument feels like it might finally be the one that opens the narcissist's eyes. Every heartfelt explanation feels like it might awaken empathy. Um, every attempt to defend your character feels necessary because you want the truth to matter. Yet the more energy you invest, the more depleted you become. Meanwhile, the narcissist often appears strangely energized after these encounters because the interaction itself reinforces their sense of control. You may have noticed something unsettling. Sometimes, when you stop arguing for a moment, they suddenly intensify their behavior. They provoke more. They criticize more harshly. They invent new accusations or revisit old wounds you thought were long resolved. Many people interpret this as evidence that they should try harder to explain themselves. But what is actually happening is that the narcissist senses a change. The emotional supply they've grown accustomed to is becoming less predictable, and unpredictability threatens the control they've relied upon. And this is where many people unknowingly return to the cycle. The discomfort of being misunderstood feels unbearable. The urge to defend your reputation becomes overwhelming. You want justice. You want fairness. You want acknowledgement. These desires are completely human, but they also become the very openings through which manipulation continues. The narcissist doesn't need you to agree with them. They only need you to stay emotionally invested in proving them wrong. The greatest shift begins when you recognize that your attention is far more valuable than you were ever taught to believe. Attention is emotional. Every minute spent obsessing over their latest message, replaying conversations, anticipating their next move, or trying to predict their reactions is emotional energy that no longer belongs to you. Without realizing it, you've been financing your own exhaustion. Real freedom does not begin the moment the narcissist changes. It begins the moment you stop organizing your emotional world around their behavior. That doesn't mean pretending you aren't hurt. It doesn't mean suppressing your emotions or becoming cold. It means recognizing that your emotional reactions no longer have to be directed by someone else's need for control. The moment you stop treating every insult as something that requires a response, every accusation as something that demands a defense, and every manipulation as something that deserves your attention, the balance of power quietly begins to change, you know? And that quiet change is where real freedom begins. Once you begin to understand that your emotional reactions have been fueling the cycle, the next question naturally becomes, so what do I do instead? This is where many people misunderstand the idea of radical indifference. They imagine it means becoming emotionless, pretending nothing hurts, or acting cold in an effort to punish the narcissist. But that isn't what radical indifference is at all. If your silence is simply another strategy to make them notice you, then you are still emotionally tied to their response. If your distance is secretly waiting for them to come running back, you are still allowing them to define your emotional experience. Radical indifference, it is the quiet decision that your emotional well-being will no longer depend on what another person chooses to do. That distinction changes everything. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly stop caring. Human beings don't work that way. Especially when you've invested years into a relationship, whether it's with a partner, a parent, a sibling, a friend, or even a coworker, your nervous system has often been conditioned to react automatically. A text message makes your heart race. A certain tone of voice fills you with anxiety. Their disappointment feels like a personal failure. Their approval feels like temporary relief. Over time, your emotional life becomes organized around anticipating their moods rather than understanding your own. Yeah. Radical indifference begins by interrupting that pattern. It asks you to notice your reactions before you obey them. Instead of immediately explaining yourself, you pause. Instead of rushing to defend your intentions, you pause. Instead of trying to convince them that they misunderstood you, you pause. That pause may seem small, but psychologically it is enormous because it creates space between their behavior and your response. In that space, you begin reclaiming something that manipulation slowly took away from you, your ability to choose. Many people fear that becoming indifferent means becoming uncaring. In reality, the opposite is true. Healthy indifference allows you to care more deeply about the people and experiences that deserve your energy. Because you are no longer wasting it trying to satisfy someone who continually moves the goalposts. You stop measuring your worth by whether they are pleased with you. You stop chasing impossible standards that change every time you get close. You begin investing that emotional energy into your own healing, your own relationships, and your own future. Well, there is another misunderstanding that deserves attention. Some people use silence as a weapon. They withdraw affection to create anxiety. They ignore messages to provoke pursuit. They disappear because they want the other person to panic. Those behaviors are still forms of manipulation because the goal is control. Radical indifference has no interest in controlling anyone. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't need someone else to suffer in order to feel powerful. Instead, it quietly releases the need to manage another person's emotions altogether. John. This is why genuine indifference often looks surprisingly ordinary from the outside. You stop over explaining. You stop rehearsing conversations that will never happen. You stop checking whether they viewed your message or liked your post. You stop trying to decode every sentence they speak as though hidden inside it is the answer you've been searching for. Life slowly becomes less centered on them and more centered on your own values, your own goals, and your own peace of mind. That shift can feel uncomfortable at first because your nervous system has been trained to expect constant emotional stimulation. Chaos becomes familiar. Calm can actually feel strange. Some people mistake that unfamiliar calm for boredom or even guilt. They wonder if they're becoming selfish because they are no longer available for every emotional crisis the narcissist creates. But what they're actually experiencing is something they've likely been deprived of for a very long time, but emotional. Blind as you continue practicing this way of being, something remarkable begins to happen. You realize that your emotions are not disappearing, they are becoming more accurate. Instead of reacting out of fear, obligation, or guilt, you begin responding from clarity. You no longer need every misunderstanding to be corrected. You no longer believe that every accusation requires a defense. You become increasingly comfortable allowing people to have opinions about you that are simply not true because your identity is no longer dependent upon convincing everyone else who you are. This is one of the greatest forms of emotional maturity. It isn't built on proving your strength. It is built on no longer needing to prove anything at all. The narcissist may continue behaving exactly as they always have. They may criticize, provoke, charm, or manipulate in familiar ways. The difference is that those behaviors no longer dictate the rhythm of your inner life. They become external events rather than internal emergencies. And that is what makes radical indifference so powerful. It doesn't change the narcissist first, it changes you first. It restores the boundary between another person's choices and your own emotional health. It reminds you that peace is not something another person grants you. Peace is something you protect by deciding where your attention, your energy, and your emotional investment truly belong. Planes. When your peace no longer depends on their behavior, their power over you begins to disappear. As you become more emotionally steady, something else begins to shift, and this is often the point that surprises people the most. Many assume that when they stop reacting, the narcissist will simply lose interest and quietly walk away. Sometimes that does happen, but very often the opposite occurs first. The narcissist notices that something has changed, even if you haven't said a single word about it. They sense that the emotional access they once had is slipping away, and because so much of their sense of control depends on that access, they frequently respond by escalating their behavior. But this is where many people become confused. They think, if I'm doing better, why are things getting worse? But what you're witnessing is not proof that your new approach is failing. In many cases, it is evidence that the old pattern is no longer working the way it once did. Dance. For a long time, the narcissist knew exactly how to get a reaction from you. They knew which subjects would make you defensive. They knew which criticisms would leave you questioning yourself. They knew how to alternate between affection and rejection until you were constantly trying to regain emotional balance. These patterns were predictable because your responses became predictable. The moment your reactions become less predictable, the narcissist often experiences that as a loss of control. One common response is something many people describe as love bombing. Suddenly, the person who seemed distant becomes unusually attentive. They may compliment you more than they have in months. They may apologize in ways they've never done before. They may promise dramatic change, talk about your future together, or remind you of happier times. If you've been longing for validation, this can feel incredibly convincing. It is easy to believe that your patience has finally paid off, but this is where emotional clarity becomes essential. Real change is consistent, it is patient, it is demonstrated over time through accountability and sustained behavior. Manipulation, on the other hand, often appears suddenly, intensely, and conveniently at the exact moment you begin pulling away. The timing matters. If change only appears when they fear losing influence, it deserves careful observation rather than immediate trust. Pond. If affection doesn't restore the old dynamic, another pattern may emerge. Anger becomes more intense. Criticism becomes more personal. You may hear statements designed to attack your confidence or make you question your judgment. They may accuse you of being selfish, cold, ungrateful, or emotionally unavailable. Notice the irony. The very boundaries that represent emotional health are often described by a narcissist as evidence that something is wrong with you. That is because healthy boundaries interrupt unhealthy access. For others, the manipulation becomes quieter. Instead of direct confrontation, they may rely on guilt. They remind you of everything they have supposedly sacrificed. They bring up old memories. They imply that you have abandoned them or become someone they no longer recognize. They know that if guilt has influenced your decisions in the past, it may still have the power to pull you back into the familiar cycle. Sometimes they involve other people, friends, family members, coworkers, or mutual acquaintances suddenly begin hearing stories about how you've changed. Your character may be questioned, your intentions may be distorted. This can feel deeply painful because most people naturally want to protect their reputation. The temptation is to defend yourself to everyone who will listen. Yet, this is another moment where emotional discipline becomes incredibly important. Not every accusation deserves your energy, and not every misunderstanding requires your participation. Bland, there may also be periods where the narcissist appears completely indifferent. They act as though they never cared. They move on quickly. They display happiness publicly or seem eager to replace you. For many, this becomes one of the most emotionally confusing experiences because it creates the illusion that the relationship meant nothing. But remember, appearances, someone who has relied heavily on external validation often works very hard to maintain an image of confidence and control. What you see publicly may reveal very little about what is actually happening internally. And the mistake many people make during this stage is believing they must interpret every behavior. They spend hours trying to decide whether the narcissist is suffering, whether they miss them, whether the relationship could still be repaired. or whether a particular message carries hidden meaning. Notice how easily the focus shifts back to the narcissist. The mind begins revolving around their emotions instead of your own healing. That is precisely the pattern you have been working so hard to leave behind. Your task is not to diagnose every move they make. Your task is to remain anchored in your own emotional reality. If they become kind, stay grounded. If they become cruel, stay grounded. If they praise you, stay grounded. If they criticize you, stay grounded. Emotional consistency is not about refusing to feel. It is about refusing to let someone else's instability dictate your internal state. Over time, something remarkable happens. The emotional hooks that once pulled you in begin losing their grip. The familiar tactics become easier to recognize. You no longer mistake intensity for intimacy or manipulation for love. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe with clarity. And in that clarity, the narcissist's ability to control your emotional world begins to fade. Bland. The greatest sign of healing is not that the narcissist changes, it is that their behavior no longer changes you.